going to have to go ISCM.
For those who are just coming into the room, we have a problem with the live stream. It's streaming on the wrong thing. It's so nice to see people, especially at a very busy time of recitals, marking. Nearly done? Brilliant. Recitals. YouTube is now streaming. Okay, this is from Nick. Brilliant.
Okay. Hi. I think we're working, we're running. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Barbara Kelly, who really doesn't need much of an introduction at the RNCM as the current Director of Research. Barbara is a world-leading expert on the music of France, particularly from the late 19th and early 20th century, is the current president of the RMA, and is a former professor at Kiel University, a visiting professor at the Sorbonne, as well as involved in lots of other institutions. Also our, very sadly, outgoing Director of Research, soon to take up a position of Professor in Health Department at the University of Leeds. So we are delighted to be hearing presentations from you now and in the future before you leave. Okay.
So lovely. Thank you very much, Larry. That was a lovely introduction and brilliant to see those of you who are here in person. That's always such a treat still. And also those joining us on Zoom and on YouTube, if it's the right channel, but I think it is now. This is my third research presentation in 1 week, all in different countries. First one was in Helsinki, on a different topic. Then there was one in Melbourne, but I didn't sadly, or maybe thankfully, get to Melbourne. It was on Zoom. And that was on a more focused element of this talk. And I'm here today. And today I'm building on the keynote I gave at the centenary conference in Salzburg for the International Society for Contemporary Music, where I've been asked to talk about London and the British side. So I've been working a bit on Britain, but Larry's absolutely right that my expertise is primarily in France. So it's been an interesting thing to look at comparisons and connections. So you'll hear me talk about the British context and the Allied context more than you might normally. So before I start, I'm doing something also slightly brave. I've had texts to read, because that's often the requirement of certain conferences and particularly keynotes. And I've got rid of my text. So that's going to be interesting. And it's because I want to engage you in a different way. And I love picking brains, and our research forum series is brilliant for that. So hopefully those of you who are here and also on Zoom, and even if you're on YouTube, you can always email larry.groves@rncm.co.uk if you have any questions at the end. And I really enjoyed the question bit. So I'm going to share the screen and to give you some context for this discussion about centres and peripheries and the early years of the International Society for Contemporary Music, in particular the idea of internationalism and what's meant by it. I've always been preoccupied by the idea of continuities, particularly at historical moments of so-called rupture. So war is particularly important. We tend to package our past in terms of up to 1914 and then do a little bit in those 4 years and then start again at 1918. Now, nothing ever works really in that way, just as it doesn't. We know that. And it's a convenience. So I've always looked for continuities across those big divides, those big moments in our history, whichever ones they are. So the idea that I've been engaging with for quite recently, the past couple of years, about sortie de guerre, so post-war transition periods, where the conditions of war continue well into moments, times of peace. So that's been helpful. And I've been working with a number of colleagues, mainly in France. One of them is Martin Guerpin, who I'd like to thank really for the exchange of ideas from that particular music and nation group. Now, the other thing that's I've always been fascinated by national and cultural and religious identities. It's been throughout all my work on different aspects of French music and culture. And more recently, we're being encouraged and almost challenged, despite language differences, to cross borders. So how do we talk about the transnational or international? And internationalism is a sort of a thing. It's people sign up to an idea of internationalism in this period of the interwar period of France. So I want to look up what that is and whether it's one who shares that idea of internationalism? Is it something that is just around particular allied or particular groups? Depending on your perspective, what do we mean by internationalism? And that really came to light when I was in Salzburg talking to people who've been working on the Austro and German context of all of this stuff. And their perspective was inevitably very different, and that was really exciting for me. So those are the sort of the context in which I'd like to place our talk. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the research, considerable research, of our colleague Rachel Cowgill, who works on the British Musical Society, who's done a lot of really important work on the origins of Flateau and Eaglefield Hull. So I'm very much indebted to her work on that. And also Karen Arundel, who I'm delighted is with us in the Zoom room. It's very rare that we allow the odd visitor to come into Zoom, but it does mean that you can pose questions more easily. But Karen's been wonderfully helpful in helping me think through the importance of London as a musical centre. It might seem an unlikely thing in that period, but it's been some wonderful work. So her work on Dent is really vital to this study. And to Matthew Worley, who's in Salzburg and invited me to the Centenary Conference. Kerry Murphy in Australia, and Giles Masters, whose work on the International Society of Contemporary Music, his PhD, was really important. So that just gives you a little bit of context. So some of the thank yous, I'm sure there are more. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Hopefully you get to see the right screen rather than some policy document on something really exciting, but you never know. Okay, I need to now do it as, okay, slideshow, here we go. Just 1 second. About this, so this is about reconnecting Europe, and what do we mean by something being European? And it is an idea that's been used more often, because obviously it's something on the tips of our lips, but to what extent were people using it then? I'm starting with a look at the British Music Society, which was founded in 1918, towards the end of the First World War, and it provides a context as to why it became London became so important for the International Society for Contemporary Music, which is still with us as a society, and that's also really important. The British Music Society has an interesting strapline, national and international, and we'll be looking at the balance of national and international in that. And the purpose of it was to foster and encourage British music at home and abroad. So it was about a revival of British musical culture, and also reflected an increasing confidence about British composition and composers in that period. Now, just looking at the patrons, the president, and those associated with it, there's a few names that jump out. Well, Balfour had been Prime Minister, and he was Foreign Secretary at the time, and he supported a number of different musical organisations, so it wasn't the first. Lord Howard de Walton was very rich and was the patron, and really funded a lot of the contemporary music, London Contemporary Music Society concerts in that period. So he was very important, and also the International Society for Contemporary Music. So he's a key figure because he had loved the arts, was committed to them, and was really into philanthropy. And we still need those figures, as we know. And then we've got Dent. So we know Dent is already involved with a foreign element. So already we're looking across the channel. Mr. Francis Toy, I'm probably not pronouncing him correctly, was associated with Liverpool, and Eaglefield Hull as a director. And then they ask a number of questions. It's about grassroots participation. So you've got prominent figures. They were keen to encourage the amateur, and they were keen to revive or to stimulate and almost connect local, regional musical activity. And I've been helped by people such as Jeff Thompson in thinking about the Manchester context for that, and for other archivists in looking at other regional societies. Okay, so you've got a picture here, or two pictures, from the first British Music Society Congress in 1920, and we've got Howard de Walden, so it's quite nice to see what they look like, and Eaglefield Hull. And Eaglefield Hull plays a central role in his sort of priorities and his ideals, but he falls away, and I've always been intrigued as to why, and I know Karen Arundel and Rachel Cowgill have been helpful in helping me think about that. So I'm trying to move on to the next one. Here we go. So national and international. I've got a rather interesting statement from Arthur Eaglefield Hull, writing in the Manchester Guardian. He writes, "Music, more than anything else, offers a means of bringing nations together to a better understanding of one another." Now, this really interests me because I've observed so many different organisations and institutions and initiatives that it started to flourish just after World War I, as an attempt to bring about music as a vehicle of peace and collaboration. Now, we know that music isn't always used for good, but there is a sense in which there is an important element of that. And I can show just how complicated that is, and it's not always as disinterested as it might seem. And the second unsigned comment is from the Musical Times. There were many, many adverts, and we've just seen one of many, and almost every issue of the Musical Times in that period had adverts to involve people in the British Music Society. The British Music Society, national and international, is a missionary body with a highly laudable purpose of advancing the cause of British music at home and abroad. So we need to think about the balance between at home and abroad in this context. Slightly reluctant to move on. Here we are. The BMS's regional mission is vital. So that idea of a federation of different associations. Again, we've got The Guardian from 1919. A British Music Society must not forget, either in the sense of export or import, that music is an international art and one of the strongest intellectual links for binding peoples together in a League of Peace. And this was just before the League of Nations was formed. So it's interesting that they're already talking about music's peacemaking role, but also about how organisation in Manchester could really benefit from being part of this wider society. And there were branches in Australia. There were two in Australia. I was hearing about them on Sunday morning very early, which is fascinating. And Louise Dyer, who's a very important figure in both France and in Britain in this period, was very much involved with the society over there. There was a branch in Belfast, in Huddersfield, and in many other places. So the idea of building and developing in order to benefit the region. So the annual Congress in 1920, you can see that there are a number of objectives of the Congress, focusing on British music. I'm sorry, this is probably quite small, on British music and musicians. Interesting, they talk about the empire, so coordinating things within the empire. Musical reconstruction in towns and the country. A way of bringing people together in discourse and alliances. And then fifth point, international reciprocity. And now that's quite low down, actually, given that the strapline is national and international. And then fundraising. So fundraising is important, and the Foundation Fund was key to that. And Lord Walton was promising to offer lots of money as long as other people signed up as well. It's a bit like, I don't know, the fund that we all use on our Facebook pages for raising money. Okay, so increasing the membership of the society. So they had quite a remit to try and revive musical activity, but in a sort of democratic way. And that's something that Rachel emphasises in her work. So in 1921, building on the success of a number of the regional societies, in particular in Huddersfield. It was a brilliant one, and they attracted some of the best performers, so Yeli Darnani, a lot of the quartets associated with Manchester, but international figures and ensembles went to Manchester, performing Scriabin, Debussy, Ravel, and many other contemporary composers. Took some time for Strauss to get on the books, but then Strauss was a figure that was treated with some caution in this period. But in some ways, the regions started out a lot of this work first. But in 1921, the London Contemporary Music Centre was founded as part of the British Music Society. You can see here that a lot of really key contemporary British composers are performed, but alongside Arthur Honegger is the foreign composer of choice on that particular occasion. And members of Les Six, newly founded, their works were being performed at many of these international societies all over Europe. You can see that's one example, but there are many examples of performances in concert halls, but also in Lord Walden's own private houses. We had a few. Okay, so the focus on international, London as an international musical centre. So I've been puzzled about where that sort of, why London could be seen as such an important centre. And I've worked on the Chesterian for many, many years, probably decades now. And Lee Henry is somebody who comments on musical life, contemporary musical life in this period. And he is so excited about what's going on in London at this particular time. He writes, "The activity of the last month, particularly in the domain of orchestral music, has been extraordinary. One feels that London has definitely developed into the hub of present-day musical life. The energy of the younger men seems to be culminating in a tide of fresh impulses, which is suffusing the mainstream of music. Everywhere one notes a new stimulus and impetus. This is not a movement in a limited coterie sense. It represents group forces of feeling and thought in the historical sense, a cumulative phenomenon contributed to by diverse factors of all types." That's quite a statement, isn't it? He's very excited. He's excited because there's a whole series of concerts, and quite notable ones. Edward Clark had a series in April 1921, where a lot of Schoenberg and also Stravinsky in various arrangements was heard in some of the main concert halls in London, and members of Les Six and Debussy and Ravel. There were a number of different concerts taking place over those few months. And the concerts of the Congress of the British Music Society, in some ways, by contrast, were less exciting from an international perspective. It was in some ways quite unusual to hear Schoenberg in that period, but Clark had studied with Schoenberg, and I've got an expert sitting across from me on this particular topic. Annika Folkert's work is very important in that. But just as in Paris, where performing Schoenberg was actually a risky thing, and it really caused a lot of often anti-Semitic comment in the French press, British composers were often more comfortable with the latest Stravinsky work, and also with Ravel and Debussy and some of that younger generation. Now, we might say that this vibrant musical life in London was really just returning to the pre-war era. Suddenly we could all hear each other's music again. Jean Bienair in Paris calls it the quest for the thirst for salad. They'd had 4 years when they couldn't hear music from other places, or very rarely, certainly contemporary music. But I argue that it's a return in some ways in terms of an exchange of music, but actually the sound world is different. You have new composers emerging, in particular the youngest generation of composers. So the programs are by no means the same, but that same excitement of the latest music from elsewhere is really, really impressive, and I think Henry captures that. Now, here we come to the Salzburg Festival in August 1922. It's an event that was organized by Rudolf Reti, and it involved music, a lot of also German composers from that wider region, actually, because we're, of course, dealing with different borders and reconfigured borders after World War I. And it was a very, very exciting event. with 54 contemporary composers from 15 different countries, and I think that figure comes from Edwin Evans's write-up. So Dent and Edwin Evans both went to this festival and wrote about it and were in great detail and were bowled over by the excitement of hearing all this music from elsewhere. And the excitement led to them gathering in a cafe I went to about a month ago, the Café Balzar, and going onto the first floor, and you can still see the entrance to that, where Dent took charge and chaired a meeting where they decided to form the International Society for Contemporary Music. So that's very exciting. Initially, everyone thought it would have to be in Vienna or in Berlin, but there was a certain rivalry that was evident. And supposedly the Americans said, well, why not London? Because London is slightly separate from these rivalries, and in some ways, and the press commented on this, in not having such a prominent musical tradition. It was felt as somehow separate from the rivalries that might exist between Vienna and Berlin for obvious reasons. So there was agreement on that. There was some consensus with some exceptions, and Reti was one of them. And you can understand perhaps the disappointment that they were sort of losing charge of this important initiative. So we'll see how we get on. But one of the works that really struck people was Bliss's Route from 1920. It's a work that people were very excited. And in many cases, performers from different nationalities were working together on music that they were just getting to know. So there was a sense of really sort of workshop style. So we've got some of the reviews here. You can see here, Edwin Evans, and we'll come back to him in a little while, in a little bit more detail. I'm trying to get rid of my own image so I can actually see the PowerPoint slide. Okay, it seems almost incredible that one can have heard so much music in 4 days, but the programs are here to vouch for it. 54 composers from 15 different nationalities. If we include Strauss, who arrived later to conduct the Mozart operas, there were more than 20 composers present. And then we have Singer writes in the Musical Courier, New York, if the first International Chamber Music Festival in Salzburg prove anything, it is a permanent need for just such festivals as this. They are necessary for one thing, in order to furnish us with a definition of modern as applied to music. And that is an important point we'll come back to. A definition which changes and must change its meaning from generation to generation, almost from year to year. I'm surely not pessimistic after this first truly international review of post-war music. So again, very enthusiastic response to this festival. Choosing London. So both Dent and Evans were there. It said Dent chaired the meeting and got over the rivalry. Evans volunteered the offices of the London Contemporary Music Centre of the London branch of the British Music Society, which was located in Berners Street in London. And that was agreed. But he hadn't got permission in advance. So he hadn't checked out with Eaglefield Hull. He had no authority to make this offer, and resolved to sort it out after the event. It was felt that the British Music Society had that federal structure in place, but also the private music performances that we know from Schoenberg in Vienna, and that this was to be imposed on a transnational level. So there were other examples of how that could work, but the structure was sort of in place. So we've got, here we are, British leadership. It gave an authority to Evans and to Dent and to London. Wherever it takes place, it will be under the control of the International, which will, however, delegate to the local section the duty of technical organisation. Dent and Evans possessed important qualities of diplomacy. They were linguists. They could easily move between languages, and I think that is key. So their rise to power was, despite being British and all the stereotypes we have about of knowledge of other languages, their ability to work in different contexts was really vital. They were also very good at organising things, and that was very evident during the Salzburg trip. And through their actions, they promised to embed the ISCM into existing post-war European musical institutions. And I've worked quite a lot on France and where that came from within that. The next big event takes place in January 1923. And we hear that, sorry, the quality of that is not great, but there was loads of coverage in the press, and often quite surprising press. So we've got the Sheffield Daily Independent, the Western Mail. You find in various local, the British newspaper library is fantastic for showing you just how something that might seem so centred in one place and so elitist is actually being picked up everywhere. I think it's a wonderful resource for getting a sense of that. So here they're talking about who's involved and what they come to London. So London was chosen for a meeting where they worked out the details of this new society and worked out the jury members. So here we are. The jury members included the following that you have on your screens. So Honegger from France, Weissmann from Germany, Gatti from Italy, Reinhardt, Switzerland, Vellum who is from Denmark, Reti, Austrian, we have American representative, Czechoslovakian rep, and also Edwin Evans from the British section. So this is how it appears in the newspaper, the report. In the end, only 4 of them were actually able to travel to Zurich, which was their next meeting, in order to examine all the scores. So they sat with all the scores, and their authority was huge. And what is interesting is that they comprise different sorts of musicians. So people who are conductors and composers and performers are in a very powerful position in this society. So we hear a number of them when they get together to vote for the jury members. We see that conductors do very well. So Guzens, for example, André Capellet, Onserme. So these are big names of the sort of the most important conductors of their time, who are often other things as well, but they were put into a very important position. So Honegger wasn't able to attend in the end, but Ravel popped in, much to everyone's surprise, and this is picked up by Dent. He says, and it conferred at once an immense distinction on this international society and on its conference. So the idea of a star, and Ravel very clearly was signed up to internationalism. He spoke out quite rarely, but when he did, it was usually about banning of, say, Schoenberg, or banning of composers, or some discrimination. He would speak out that this was an unhealthy thing. Okay. Edwin Evans, I've mentioned him a few times. So here you can see his dates, but you can also see a rather interesting portrait by Wyndham Lewis. And there's another picture from the press. So in that January meeting, they all went to Piketty's important, very popular restaurant in London, and they presented Evans this portrait that had been done. And it was composers who got together, composers supposedly, according to one critic on the left of the, so a bit more radical, because they recognised his value. And this has always interested me. We tend to give prominence to somebody like Dent, because he became the real star, the real figurehead. But a critic, such as Edwin Evans, is really vital, because if you look at the correspondence of Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, and we've got some of the letters, Stravinsky letters, and Vaughan Williams as well, at the British Library, you will see that Evans is working behind the scenes quite clearly in a lot of detail, working to understand their music, asking to see scores and writing about these composers. So this was a presentation which everyone admitted was slightly unusual, that it should be to a critic. But it shows that in the ecology of musical organisations, you need everyone there. You need the Evanses of this world who have organisational skills, language skills, and a real understanding of the sort of contemporary music scene and ability to comment on it. So Evans is, and he had a brilliant evening with rather famous composers from all over Europe, because it coincided with this international meeting. I've written in my last monograph on music and ultramodernism about composer-critic pairings, and about how essential the sort of relationship, symbiotic relationship that they often have, particularly the prominent, really perceptive critics who work very hard in order to, I suppose, shape the reputations of composers. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance. Now, Vaughan Williams didn't understand this, and he didn't contribute to this gift. And he said he didn't understand, and Evans was quite hurt by this. He said, why am I rewarding you for, it's almost like paying you to say nice things. But actually, I think he failed to understand the importance of that, the relationship that can take place between different musicians with different skills. Evans's advocacy and his acceptance speech. So I mentioned the correspondence that we have, and particularly close with Stravinsky, Debussy and Raval. And he writes, this is quoted in the Musical Times, this is Evans, after a strenuous fight lasting many years, they had at last reached a time when the musical world, which was once an imperial state, was now a federal republic. Now that is a curious statement, and I will come back to that. What does he mean by a federal state, an imperial state, and a federal republic? There's clearly a determination to do something. It is not neutral, and it's not necessarily completely benign. Okay, we'll come back to that. So we've got these simultaneously existing and coexisting national, international, and European impulses, I suppose, coming from different intentions. So the perceptions of the jury selection were picked up in the press, and people immediately thought they were somehow being outdone. So we have Britain was represented by Arthur Bliss, William Walton, and Lord Berners. Now think of the choice of those composers. Arthur Bliss, you can understand that he's really made his mark in the previous year with Rout, and this time it's his Rhapsody. William Walton was northern from Oldham. He's a local fellow to here, and he was very young. And this was seen as being, well, why are we representing British music by somebody such as Walton? And Lord Berners, well, he was very eccentric. I'm sure you're aware of Lord Berners' music, and the valse bourgeoise are quite fun and not serious music. But we'll see Dent's comments on that. I think it probably is time to hear a little bit of that music. Would you like to hear a little bit of music from the repertoire? So it just means I have to stop sharing and then share again. But let's hope it will work. So a bit of Bliss Rhapsody, that'd be nice. Yeah? I think it will work. Sound?
You need to share this.
So how do I do that? Sorry. Could you help me, please? Unmute? No. Okay, excuse me, folks. I can do it at the start of something, but I don't know how to do it in the middle of something.
If you just want to share the audio, you can just share computer audio. And then stuff.
Thank you very much. just for the sake of time. Okay. Go back to screen share. Okay. And how do I get out of that? Sorry, basic. I need to go back to screen. I think I've done it. I think. Yeah. Apologies for my lack of technical skills. One second. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the real contrast between the sorts of work. Remember, pretty much every member of Lysis was represented at these concerts as well, and of course the schools from all over Europe. Now Dent writes something interesting, which I think he makes overclaims. These programmes present a survey of the whole output of modern chamber music. It is needless to say that for such a work to be accepted unanimously by musicians of such eminence and such diversity of taste confers a European reputation on its composer. I haven't seen many cases where that claim is made. He also argues that actually there's much more fun and diversity in the programmes for the 1923 festival, which is this one, rather than 1922. I think he's overstating that claim in many ways, but it's because there was music by Lord Berners and sitting alongside the Austro-German contributions. So you can see here, which is interesting, this is from the festival of the August 1923 Chamber Music Festival. You can see here they talk about London in this and how the jury has selected. So they're showing out of 200 works, they've arrived at this particular programme. Okay, so I want to place the international society in the context of the post-war transition period. And we've got a number of interesting comments here. It's important to remember that this is a period of great financial crisis, of extreme poverty. The reparations for Germany were absolutely huge. And if you look at just one page, I think I took a page of the Scotsman from that period, and you can see that discussions of the International Society for Contemporary Music are placed literally side by side, all the discussions around the Ruhr, around the reparations, and around various other sort of conflicts. And I think it's important that we remember that. We don't see things in sort of isolation. So here Evans writes, in marked contrast to the acute antagonisms which rend the world of affairs, the atmosphere was throughout genial, and even the language difficulties seemed to present no obstacle. At a moment, a gathering of this kind appears unique and to remind one of a happier Europe. Again, that appeal to a European, a happier, an idealized Europe. And then I've also come across here we are. This is Romain Rolland, a really important writer and commentator from the period, and he's writing the Westminster Gazette, and it's again the tensions between France and Germany in particular, which are it's useful to be reminded of them, because we take for granted that Milhaud and Schoenberg performed together, or that they were all getting together in various parts of Europe. But this was something more remarkable. They really were resisting something that was very much in their everyday. So he writes, French and German composers found themselves working along the same lines and met in the greatest harmony, performing each other's works and sympathizing with each other's aims. What was happening in Salzburg could not occur in either France or Germany at the present time. Okay. Despite the world of politicians, the true world, the world of thought, moves inexorably closer together. I thought that's an interesting comment, and it might also explain why London, I don't know actually, you would think there'd be a lot of tensions there too, but particularly between France and Germany in that period. So, cultural internationalism. I'm not going to be very theoretical at all, but I have looked at the work, I pronounce it very well, Akira Iriiri. Somebody wants to correct that for me, that is fine. But that term, cultural internationalism, is something that we need to take seriously. I've seen many examples of it from the people I've been looking at. Giles Masters is helpful here. He writes, to label oneself international in 1922 signified a moral political commitment, an internationalism, and an associated subject position, an internationalist. So in some ways, it's about signing up to something. It's about agreeing to be something or identify an issue of identity. And then a critic in the Times writes, music with its independence of difficulties of language, of course that's very Eurocentric, has a special opportunity for furthering that intercourse between individuals of different countries, which may introduce into the lump sum a leaven of good understanding. I've worked a lot on the French critic, musicologist, Henri Prunière. He was director editor-in-chief of La Revue Musicale, which he founded in 1920. Hugely important figure, but more behind the scenes than Dent. And he was very politically aware. He was very good in bringing together and then various musicians. And he was the founder of the French section of the International Society. And it was in his offices that the International Society had its base. But he was never at the top of the list, unlike Dent, who loved to run things. Prunière stayed slightly more behind the scenes. He was also instrumental in setting up the revived International Musical Society in 1927. But again, he kept more in the background. He writes to Vallas, and I've worked on Vallas, a critic who was very nationalist, who was had all sorts of prejudices and was much more complicated. He writes to him, I fully understand your point of view in wanting to protect French artists, but it is not mine. Because I run a journal that is essentially international, I consider that my role is to make French music known abroad, and in order to achieve this, I need to deserve the reputation as a protector of foreign music in France. So the balance between what you're projecting abroad and what you're protecting and bringing in is quite equal and feels a little bit different from the balance that we have with the British Music Society and where the national versus international sits. Now he set up a concert series in 1921 where he invited, Bartók was frequently there. There was a lot of Schoenberg, an awful lot of Stravinsky, a lot of Liszt. Composers came and performed their work, and it was very much, he has this wonderful image of the Tower of Babel. In fact, he writes about the Tower of Babel, where people are speaking several languages all at once in his offices. And he said, this is brilliant. You might hear Segovia performing or some other major pianist playing something, and there would be silence, a sort of respect for this music that somehow brought people together. So he was a card-carrying internationalist in all sorts of ways. He writes about Dent because he was very close to Dent, and Karen Arundel has helped identified a number of sort of correspondence between the two, and it goes back to their days as musicologists in the pre-war era. He writes, the Assembly had re-elected its president, the eminent critic, English critic, unanimously, because of his devotion to the cause of artistic internationalism and a firm and prudent politics which had helped him to succeed in overcoming the countless pitfalls he had encountered. Now, in the same journal, his own journal, La Revue Musicale, Dent had written, this society has nothing to do with politics. I have absolutely no engagement with politics. I'm not an internationalist. And of course, it's not true. He didn't involve himself in very particular cases. He didn't necessarily defend when there were all sorts of tensions between the Soviet and other sections. He didn't become personally involved in some things, except very much behind the scenes. And he did a lot during in the lead up to World War World War II to help certain Jewish musicians and academics. But he pretended not to be an internationalist. And there are perhaps all sorts of reasons for it. But Prunière's right in saying his very careful politics and diplomacy, he was absolutely the right choice. I'm very keen also to look at what was meant by internationalism, because there's a strong strain of anti-German attitudes, and I'd love to do a study that looked much more at different parts, looked around Europe to to what extent did they all sign up to the same idea of what it meant to be international? Because as early as 1910, Evans is writing about a much closer relationship between France and Britain, and that Britain had to somehow shed its almost slavish association with German models in order to have a sort of healthier sort of rapport with France. So he's arguing it's as early as 1910, and there are probably many other examples of it, but I've given you one from the translation he did of Jean Aubry's book. Jean Aubry, again, also was funded by the French state to do propaganda in Britain about French music, and working with the Chester in the journal associated with Chester Press. So he writes about this sort of natural rapport that on either side of the channel, and this is in 1919 when the translation was made. And Dent writes, "The formation of the International Society has put matters on a much broader basis. The programmes for this year certainly include works of a grave and serious character, but they are well balanced by music of a definitely cheerful outlook, and the greatest care was taken at Zurich to make programmes attractive as well as interesting." So that's, I think, pretty important in thinking about what sort of, what is he doing in influencing and shaping musical internationalism in that period. What are the new allegiances is really my view. And in shaping a post-war internationalism, should we say that Dent and Evans and many of those associates, Prunière as well, were involved in redefining and rebalancing musical aesthetics and taste in that post-war period? I think that's something we need to look at, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts. So I've come up with this idea of a post-war allied musical international that reflects the recent political tensions that have been there, and that is in some ways a reshaping and steering. I've been working on an AHRC project that's looking at an edition that popped up in France with Durand, the publishers, and it was devoted to the classics, to Mozart, to Beethoven, to Bach, to a lot of the Austro-German classics, and of course Chopin. I think I've talked about Chopin a few years ago. And it's not great scholarship. They weren't interested in the sources. They weren't doing the wonderful work that many of our esteemed colleagues do in finding every example. But what they wanted to do was to say that in France, we can have an edition of the classics, because the classics are our culture too. We can share in that. So rather than Mozart, Beethoven in some ways being above the fray of politics, they're very much part of them. France, and perhaps other countries too, want to share in that predominantly Austro-German musical heritage. So seen alongside that, this initiative, which became a big project well into the interwar period, and was used by major performers and professional performers, and Robert Cassel-Dessous is a great case in point. And Yvonne Loriot, of course, the second wife of Messiaen, grew up on a diet of the edition classique of the classics, so learning her Brahms through this edition. And Cassel-Dessous toured the whole of Europe and North America, again using these editions. So there was a sense of a sort of one-upmanship. And we see this one-upmanship in this French determination to come up with these, have their own editions, and also in British initiatives to revive their own musical culture and to say, yes, we can lead this international society that is European plus America, effectively. It's by no means international. It's a very small notion of what we mean by that. But we can recenter positions of power, and that power rests on the fact that we've recently been in conflict. So I would say that music as a source of peace and cooperation, it's a wonderful ideal, but the reality of it is much more nuanced and I guess politically inflected, and reflects the times in which these composers and conductors and performers were moving and exchanging ideas and playing music together.
thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I'm keeping an eye on YouTube and Zoom and in the room for some questions. Because we start in the room with experts in this area. So, do you have any questions in the room? Jeff, always first off the mark.
Fantastic. Not always.
Don't do it on first.
Not always.
Thank you so much, Barbara. At this period, London isn't just the capital of the UK, it's the capital of a very large empire.
Yeah.
And the one thing that comes across is that the music of the empire is not at all represented in Britain's contribution. Is this something that was commented on at the time, or is it simply taken as read that British music was very much the music?
It's a very good point, and it's interesting that there is a mention of empire in the British Music Society, that advert that we saw much earlier on. There's also a reference to that Evans makes about sort of imperialism, but I think he's actually talking about also German musical imperialism of sorts and wanting to challenge that. It really doesn't figure. I mean, that certainly in the what's being put forward for consideration at the International Society it reflects mainly England. Actually, it's a British in the smallest sense of the word. But it's a good point, and we might find that Annika and others, and maybe Karen, have thoughts on that particular one. But I haven't seen a wider reflection, apart from the sections of the British Music Society, which really did, Australia has important activity going on, and their sense of identity. It was one of the questions I had on Sunday morning, that that idea of being Australian wasn't maybe quite so, it wasn't so divorced from being British, and that's something that came in later on. So what do we mean by British, I suppose, would also be the question.
It just is ironic, it's international.
Yeah. It is. Well, it's primarily English, I would say. Although, pardon, and Ethel Smythe is in the 1922 programme, but not in the 23. So she's there before it became a society. It is very Melba, very. In fact, some of the reviews pick up on that. All these young men getting their works performed in Europe. Female performers, definitely, and they're pretty important. Linda.
Yes, Barbara, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. What struck me was with your reference to the collaboration, if you like, between composers and critics at the time. So that's a relationship which has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a few more words about that, because you suggested that actually composers would be actively aligning themselves with critics who would report favourably on their work, and that would be a means to develop their careers. We always think about collaborations between composers and performers who perform their work. I don't know that today we would think about trying to find an amiable critic who would support composers. I think social media and obviously the plethora of reviews that now come out from all sorts of different online sources have changed that. But it just struck me that relationship that you were alluding to.
It's really,
very strong
really, really strong and really vital, sort of beneficial for both sides. There's a lot of that that's going on in France. I mean, around Debussy's reputation, and he almost relied on spokespeople, on people to form that role of advocacy on his part. Stravinsky did it too. He rarely wrote his own press releases or whatever. He did early on, but increasingly relied on spokesmen actually to do that for him, and to do it very skillfully. And Ansemé is definitely one of them, and Arthur Laurier, and the different phases, Roland Manuel. Yes, really, really strong. And I've traced how Les Six do it. And actually one of them gets left out. Roland Manuel gets left out because he's so busy writing about Ravel that his own music becomes neglected. And that's commented on by Poulenc, for example. So there's a strong sense of that. But it's not just, I mean, the way you said it was sort of, well, they're just trying to find a friendly critic. They sort of are, but it's a more I think it's a more engaged, it's a little bit of co-creation, a little bit, that they're shaping musical aesthetics of that period, and there's a strong sense of it. And there isn't a division between musicology and criticism of contemporary music in that period. Anybody who was a sort of musicologist, and remember it's an emerging thing, particularly in France. In Britain it's got a more complicated and slightly different history. But there's almost a requirement for musicologists' commitment to writing about contemporary music at the same time as doing their scholarship on Monteverdi or Lully in Prunier's case, or Mozart and Scarlatti and other examples of Dent. So Evans, less of a musicologist, but they saw the two as really important. And I think in Britain, probably overlapping in terms of the musical association, that those composers were very much part of that particular organisation. So we're in different times. And Larry said to me many times, why don't we get our musicologists here to pair up with our composers and do something together? And we're not so comfortable necessarily, except for those who devote themselves to contemporary music, musicology, and there are, of course. So we're in different times, but it's a really good comment, really interesting issue. David?
Yeah, thanks. I'm usually flying off and forth. Thank you very much for talking. Apologies again. One thing I've been reading quite a lot recently, I don't necessarily subscribe to it, but there is a criticism of contemporary musicology, contemporary music, in that it's not really critical. And it can sometimes fall in a hanging around it. I don't think it's supposed to be used, you all know everything I'm talking about. And I mean, you know, if you think science is a wonderful book, but you know you're going to be reading it from the perspective of someone who's clearly devoting it for that reason. I'm just wondering if the musicological perception of contemporary composers from the 20s was actually engaging critically, or if it could be accused of sort of saying pitfalls that perhaps contemporary musicians use.
I think it really depends. If it's a writer, they wouldn't necessarily be a musicologist. But if it's a critic who is a disciple, then they're writing as an advocate, and they aren't independent. In setting up La Revue Musicale, which is not a musicological journal, but it's somewhere in between, where study of music of the past and a lot of contemporary music coexists. And he talked about an idealized criticism that went beyond I'm backing you, or I'm just writing about this brilliant singer or whatever, that had a critical edge. And in fact, Prunier and Poulenc have a spat when Prunier says, I'm not there just to write what you want me to write. I'm there to do something that is independent. So I think there are some people who really do see that, but you'd have to look at the specifics, at the particular individuals. And there'll be a lot of hagiography too.
But we have a question from Gavin on Zoom. I can read it out, but Gavin, you can just ask a question if you prefer.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
I'll keep my video off, but thanks, Barbara. This is really interesting. And I've got two questions if there's time. I'm just interested, who attended, if you know, the BMS concerts in London? Was it mainly critics and composers? Was it a more general audience? I mean, in the back of my mind, I'm right in saying that Schoenberg actually banned critics from his Verein concerts and so on. So I'd be interested to know who was there. And the second question is, do we know how the BMS influenced sort of later organisations, if at all, such as the Arts Council or the British Council? Because a lot of what I was reading from the 1922 quote that you put up on screen looks really similar to what we read in Arts Council publications and so on.
Great questions, and I can't promise to answer everything adequately, but I'll have a go. I think the whole issue of who was at the concerts is really interesting because they were very preoccupied by the issue of audience. How do you create an audience for contemporary music? That was really fundamental to the British Music Society, and it's also really important with Prunier with his concerts. And there are different views on this, but I know that Dent, they talked about the enlightened amateur in some ways, in Britain particularly. The enlightened amateur sometimes being better than the professional, who often has all sorts of prejudices about the music that are asked to play, but almost appealing or training, wanting to train an audience, hence that commitment to regional musical life, whether it's Manchester or Huddersfield or wherever it is. So who came to in the British Music Society, the regional concerts would have been very much open. In the London Contemporary Music Centre, they certainly lament at the congresses that the concerts aren't that well attended. And there are all sorts of debates. They have these big debates where they get billions, loads of people and organisations to all have their 10-minute slot. So it must have been fascinating, gone on forever as well. But really interesting on big topics around contemporary music and audiences. I'm sure that definitely figures. Prunier is fascinating because he almost tried to use marketing, and he talks about, he tries to sell it by talking about the Tower of Babel, but he comes up with it's a bit like those, when you sign up to go to a hotel but you don't know which one it is, the sort of secret thing, a secret location, and you're taken somewhere. It's a bit like that they don't announce a programme. They say you're going to have this amazing experience. I think it was Mule's, one of his quartets, maybe the fourth or fifth. But that was eventually on the programme. But they've been calling it concerts for the elite. So very similar to some of Schoenberg's thinking. But I would say that critics were definitely not banned, and that they would be cultivated. So going back to that earlier issue, and some would be more open to that than others. But I don't know if Karen has thoughts. Karen on Zoom, rather than at the back of the room, has thoughts on that issue of audience. Can't hear you, Karen. Still can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't on audience, but I do a little bit on jury, I suppose, which is slightly separate, but it's a part of the same thing, really. The audiences, they wanted to be as inclusive as possible. And I don't know about the London Contemporary Music Centre audiences so much. There's not much actually said about them. At the time, they were all focusing on what was going on the continent and hoping eventually to bring it back to Britain, which they did, of course, in 1931. And that was down to a lot of Evans's hard work, of course. But I think the thinking generally about the time was that whole directive that Eaglefield Hull had said in that first statement, which you partially quoted, but it was to educate that the BMS was actually dedicated towards. They wanted to build up the audiences, but they didn't quite know how to do it, except through filtering down to the regions, through the regional centres. But then gradually, at the same time, there were several educational movements going on at around the late 1920s, early 1930s, of which one, the Cambridgeshire report into music, is probably the most well-known, I think. Dent actually wrote it eventually. He didn't want to, but he took it over eventually. But it included that kind of a brief, which was to make sure that music, the idea of music and the capacity for hearing live performances and performing themselves was all a part of an ordinary educational system. So that's one of the things I think they were actually aiming at and really getting back to grassroots. And that was picked up later on in the Arts Council brief. There is, as I think you pointed out, somebody pointed out, a direct line between the British Music Society ideals and the later Arts Council stuff, partly because a lot of the same people were involved eventually. There is not just Dent, but people like Eric Walter White, Francis Toy, people like that, just people whose names you hear, you realize were actually involved. I don't know if that actually answers the question, but it sort of opens it up a bit.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And I think it does answer Gavin's question around the links to Arts Council, and certainly, and the overlapping networks is something where the same names pop up and all of these things, a lot of these organisations is really important thing. And the importance of music education is absolutely on the agenda of these big discussion topics that they tackle in the congresses. Annika?
There's also kind of one anecdote that kind of ties in with that question of audiences as well. I remember reading a review from a critic of the Times who'd been to London Contemporary Music concerts in 24, where Clark was doing his work sort of that. And the team got a bit upset because it was a very, very informal evening apparently. So Clark came and took his jacket off and greeted the musicians. The musicians had kind of beer standing on stage and the curtain. And they were all saying hello to each other, and Clark went over and greeted the reader with a handshake, and then he greeted people in the audience too, who he knew. So London Contemporary Music concerts, I think, it's just one platform, may not be as it always was, but there was a critic of the Times present, for whom it wasn't formal enough, the whole thing. And there were people who were greeted by Clark who conducted anyways. So
that's really interesting.
It's probably a combination of
I think I've seen references to informality, and that's an important thing. I mean, I guess some of those concerts were taking place in Walton's own home, so that would immediately put it into a more of a sort of salon sort of situation almost, wouldn't it? It would take it away from the sort of formal concert venue.
Yeah, plus also this idea, of course, of kind of perhaps the ideas of socialism, this kind of conducting Stravinsky's kind of work. So I'm taking my jacket off and I'm greeting my musicians and not.
Okay, that's interesting.
Targeted there.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. I don't know if people on Zoom could hear that, but it's around informality with Clark at some of at least one of the concerts, contemporary music concerts in London. Yeah, in about 1924. Great. Oh, great. Good. I like that. Go on.
It's really, really fascinating work. Thanks so much. I'm really interested in a lot of things. I love going to my cabin. I think there are parallels with today.
Yeah.
There's so many strikingly obvious parallels in a post-Brexit society that being involved in political space to be European, and what you said about this sort of cultural internationalism. Discourses, rhetoric surrounding regional, whole level of agenda and what that means for music living. Manchester as a cultural site and what we're living to remind people in London that is the case. We're rediscovering music, rebuilding music after a pandemic. There's so many really stark parallels to me. And of course there's this huge, massive backdrop of poverty, social, real kind of social problems that play out today in different ways. And then the comments on the reality and the idea, why the narrative weaves between those two things, that to me is all very, very interesting. And I wonder whether you could tease this a little bit, haven't you, with this sort of reality and ideal and how the narrative is constructed to kind of, is it masking one to reach the other, or is it trying to marry the two? Talk a little bit more about that.
All right, great. For those of you on Zoom, Jenny's sort of made comparisons between the period I'm talking about, which is a period of coming out of conflict, and also the pandemic, the flu pandemic in that period as well, and also our post-Brexit and post-pandemic world now, and cultural revival, regeneration, levelling up, although often, I don't think I've ever said that in a research talk before, that term, and that the emphasis on regional identities and music making, but actually seen within a context of poverty and social difficulties. That's really interesting. I think there inevitably are connections and the sort of ideas certainly around to say you're European means something. For us British, I guess, to say we are still European is a statement, and it's a political statement, maybe in the way if they were saying they were internationalists. So when Prunier says to Vallas, who's an arch nationalist, my mission is this, we might very well perhaps make a statement to say, well, actually, I'm European and my connections with Europe. And we might do that structurally. And I know we've made some initiatives in the Royal Music Association to set up a network of European musicological societies. And that is in response to our own times. So, but on other sorts of levels of regional music making, that would be an interesting thing to look at our culture now and maybe address some of the frustration that our perhaps our composers have, that we don't have enough interest, perhaps, as we should, in looking at our culture today. Good point.
Yeah, actually, strangely, I feel like slightly following from Jenny's area of interest there. I wonder if you could clarify something for me. Obviously, the thorny question of what it means, what British means, English, maybe we won't go there today, but I'm very interested in what they thought European meant, because from I understand the angle, the way that you come in through your French interest and then British stuff, but I'm interested in who is performing, presenting, and attending as an audience, because we didn't hear anything from either Scandinavia or Southern Europe. And I was just wondering to what extent, it seemed to me, if there's part of obviously was that, Germany is certainly central, physically, geographically, in Hungary, then we had Switzerland, Austria, Germany, France.
Yeah.
But above and below, as it were.
Yeah. Okay.
What did they think Europe was? Because you could think it could be a bit cheeky to say it's European, not to actually know
I would say that thank you, fantastic question as well. I'll answer bits of it at different times, but certainly in terms of North and South Europe, the Italian section, actually they withdrew from the 1923. Their nose was put out of joint. It was Casella, because there wasn't enough Italian music on selected, so they were cross because there was lots of French. And even the voting system for the jury members, Dent made them keep voting until they actually got a French person on there, and it was Capelin. So all this tends to be ideal. That there are different powers that are emerging. But the Italians were the sort of modern Italian schools very closely allied to France in that period. A lot of them spent a lot of time, like Casella and many others, Piero as well, spent a lot of time in France and worked very closely with colleagues there. In fact, Prunier was really close to the Italians because his research was on Italy. So I would say the particularly close relationship there. And actually, I think Casella grew to accept that they probably shouldn't have got into a huff and pulled out. And probably Karen is going to correct me on some of the details of this, but certainly Italy's there. And in Spain, there was a number of years later, and Giles Masters has written about this, there was an International Society for Contemporary Music festival in Spain, and I forget the year offhand. Gradually, I mean, by international, they mean Europe plus America.
Australia.
Not even, yes, I guess with the British Music Society, but the International Society for Contemporary Music, it was Louise Dyer, I think, when she went to she started going to these festivals, and it was then that the Australian section, she set it up for France, but she did that, but because she was present in Europe. So I think by international, they mean Europe, and by international, they also mean a very particular perspective on Europe. And that's why we need more scrutiny of from a different perspective, and that would be very easy to do, and probably in collaboration with colleagues working on that. But in terms of identity, I asked that question. British Music Society in Belfast is really interests me, from my cultural background, and I was interested in that in 1921. Obviously, the rest of Ireland gained independence, and so Belfast was part of Britain, United Kingdom, and then it was revived again in the 70s, I believe, or 80s. And I'm really interested in that and what they mean by it. So I think it really depends on context about what we mean by Britain, and it's a big question and one that is fascinating. Okay. Yeah, go on. Oh yeah, I forgot to ask you a question.
I was really struck by this idea of exchange. Where I'm paraphrasing, but it seems to say that it was French music abroad. I have to be a champion for foreign music in France. That's how the acceptance works.
Yeah.
As an exchange. And again, that kind of reminded me of Edwin a little bit later, in concert in Moscow, where he plays the BBC almost exclusively British music ever. And then the newspapers there reported that he was such a champion on Soviet and Russian music in Britain. So it's the same this idea of exchange of someone who kind of perhaps is accepted in two worlds because they always bring the other to that world respectively. I don't know if that's a thing, or if that's a coincidence, and that these two people seem to be trying to do that. But if that isn't, maybe one of the ways that in which this internationalism works at the time.
That reciprocity of one bringing in the other, and it being
and therefore being accepted
in both places.
In both places and in both directions.
Well, what's interesting is this link with France, because you've got the French government sort of supporting this sort of propaganda of in Britain in that time. There isn't a massive amount of British music being played in the concert series societies, and even in Prunières, there's not a lot of British music being performed there at all. And there's the exception. So Guzens he can cross borders because he's well known in Europe. Yeah. So there isn't reciprocity. But the idea of wanting that exchange, the British Evans and many of the other, I think Dent as well, and Hull, they're frustrated that the government doesn't sponsor it, that they're not giving any money. So they complain that there's no money to send these people over to Salzburg, even though Britain's not in such a bad financial situation as they are over there. And they were looking to the French for their model because they have this, what is called AFA, it's the Échange Artistique, and Robert Broussel headed it for a long time, and Courtauld was involved, pianist Courtauld was involved in it for a long time, and that becomes a Foreign Affairs Office, are sending people around Europe and North America and controlling that, and they want something similar in Britain, and it's not that. So I think exchange is a key thing, but I like that idea of reciprocity. You asked about displacement now. Displacement is a major theme in that period as well, with borders being changed and with musicians not having a home. So there's Federico Lazzaro has written about the International Society for Contemporary Music, looking precisely at those who became stateless. So Stravinsky was okay, because even though he wasn't officially French, he was always in the French section. But there were many people who didn't make any section because they weren't accepted, and that becomes really quite exclusionary, and it's complicated. Adam?
Well, yeah, especially Stravinsky, because one thinks about after World War I, the sort of the growing perceived threat of bolshevism and communism, and dreadful things were going on in Soviet unions, Civil War at the time. People were talking about. I wonder whether it was possible to reach out to Russia at all with its violent history, recent history of great composers, authors, etc.
What I've noticed in looking at certain certainly British music culture in that period. There's a lot of interest in Russian music, and then the Russian Revolution happens, and that's sort of when I find that in the Chesterian, they sort of switch from being fascinated with Russia to looking towards France, and of course Stravinsky remains very much in view. But there are it became quite complicated, and maybe Karen can probably tell us more. But certainly around, there are a lot of tensions around the Soviet, some of the later festivals and different political positions in relation to the Soviet.
You could argue that Stravinsky's great period as a coffee as well, that music became less Russian and more European in this period.
Absolutely, they're regarded as being, well, certainly Stravinsky's regarded as being French, and Prokofiev probably for some time ago, of course, he returned to Russia. But it's a complicated thing around the Soviet Union, and would need to have a think. But certainly, yes, in relation to Stravinsky, they love the sound of his music because it's Russian, but not because they see it as sort of part of Europe. Michelle?
Thank you, fascinating. And mine's probably a naive question. This is all new to me and really, really interesting. But I got quite excited with some of those initial quotes that you showed, like the one in The Guardian: music is an international art, one of the strongest intellectual links, providing you could a legal piece. And I thought, wow, this is obviously an organisation that's very open, very welcoming, very keen to bring people on board. Was it that? Or from some of the things you said, it sounds like it was also quite elitist. It could also be quite exclusionary. So, where did it sit there? Was it quite an open and welcoming, all in way saying, "Is a music great? Let's invite everyone in," or was it still quite an elite club that how people didn't like?
It's certainly, the British Music Society is trying not to be elite. It is trying to be grassroots. It does still involve big figures. In fact, they make a statement that you couldn't be a professional and be sort of on the committee, I think, at one point. But that's not actually true. It's not what happened. So in that sense, it's quite democratic, and it is trying to involve people in music making in their particular locations. But the balance between the British and the international is really about promoting British music abroad and wanting it to be noticed and being part of the conversation and not to be left out and seen as the land without music. So the one-upmanship is about asserting, I would say. And I think the international bit, I think Hull had really high ideals and held them very passionately and lived up to them. But it's complicated. And I think figures such as Dent and Evans are genuinely interested in music from elsewhere, absolutely. Larry?
Definitely not a question, but just following up from that, in the aftermath of the Second World War, you see much less of the rhetoric around peace and sort of togetherness in music. But you do see quite a lot of investment from the United States into Germany, new classical music. There are sensational ideas of the Darmstadt but CIA, which is very controversial. But you certainly have bell laboratories going to Darmstadt. You definitely have those kinds of investments. Is this fertile ground to make comparisons between the aftermath of the First and Second World War? That shift both in rhetoric and in the reality of the investment. I know that's a response to the Soviet Union as well, but because it seems like there's a different kind of relationship. It's actually
After the Second World War. I'm not the expert on that, but there are people who have written about the International Society in the Second World War. And Bjorn Heil is doing an interesting work in looking at the more recent history of the International Society, which of course is, and how it starts to become a bigger thing and it's spread to many more countries. So it starts very narrow. But I think those comparisons are interesting, but I'm probably not best placed at the moment to answer them immediately.
We have any more questions? I'm going to come down because we have enough people here to advertise briefly for our next two sessions. Next week we have 2 more sessions this term. Next week we have Amanda Babington talking about researching forgotten composers, directly connected to her work with the musette and an instrument that is equally evaporative. And then the week after we have Professor Adam Gore talking about his 24 preludes, and you'll also be able to hear those for the second time because you will have been to the concert the day before with Claire Hammond, 2 days before, sorry.
No, the day before.
The day before.
Just some of the preludes.
Some of the preludes, which will be with Claire Hammond and students of the RNCM, and we'll have some of the students playing in the forum as well. And then finally, the very first research forum of next term on the 28th of September will be an important occasion because it will be Barbara's final presentation at the RNCM, not the final ever, but before you move on, and it will also mark the end of Denny Ernand's tenure as the International Chair in Musicology. So it's going to be a really important occasion. But for now, Barbara, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and a wonderful conversation as well, and we can continue.
Definitely continue. Thank you very much, and let's chat in the bar. Thanks for your interest in some